Hello, everybody. Welcome back to week 2. We're now in part 3 of our lecture series for week 2. We're continuing our discussion about parenting, taking an historical perspective here. And we're going to talk now about the Industrial Revolution. If you remember back studying this in the past, there was a very high demand for labor during the Industrial Revolution. In textile factories, children worked 12 plus hours every day under terrible, unsafe conditions. In 1833, there was the Factory Act, which banned children under the age of 9 from working in factories. However, children between the ages of 9 to 13 years could work up to 12 hours a day, and 13 to 18-year-olds could work up to 69 hours a week. Also, during the Industrial Revolution, coal mines used children as young as 5 until the mid-1800s. This next slide here depicts children working in the coal mines. Shifting our focus here to the Great Depression. During that time, jobs were very scarce, and there was an outcry against child labor practices. So the Fair Labor Standard Act was passed in 1938 and banned child labor in factories as well as in mining. In child labor today, it's important to note that in developed countries, child labor is highly regulated due to fair labor laws. And in developing countries, child labor is still considered necessary. And in the year 2004, 218 million children around the world were in the labor force. It's also important to note here human trafficking, and that is something that actually still exists around the world as well as in our country, the United States. It's important to note that we have many wonderful people in lots of different fields, including law enforcement, that are working very hard to end human trafficking, but that is something that we want to pay attention to. There are many children here in the United States that are forced to labor in many unsafe and terrible conditions. So there's takeaways here that we want to take away from childhood when we view it from a historical perspective. Childhood is a time of development separate from work, and labor is a fairly recent concept. And the factors that impact societal views on childhood include economic conditions, longevity, and technology. Additional historical perspectives on parenting tell us that parenting practices have been deeply influenced by economic and political conditions, religion, philosophers, physicians, and psychologists. Now we're going to shift our focus and our conversation a bit to talk about religion and parenting. And Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all emphasize the importance of children and parenting. In Confucianism, children are raised to respect their elders, and parenting practices are dictated by core beliefs about the nature of children upon birth. So think of children as sinners. Early Christians believed that children are born with original sin. So we want to ask the question, what is the role of parents if this is true? It's essentially the role of parents is to correct children through discipline and punishment. And in early Christian families, fathers took the lead because they were stronger and wiser, and mothers were considered to be overly indulgent. Looking at the Puritans, which were around during the 16th to 17th century, they used public shaming to punish children. Here's a graphic depiction of that public shaming that was implemented in Massachusetts. John Wesley, who lived between 1703 and 1791, was the founder of the Methodist Church, and he advocated for frequent corporal punishment. It's important to note in the year 2004, the United Methodist Church banned corporal punishment. You can see things are shifting here. When we talk about philosophy and parenting, it's important to look at John Locke's work. John lived between the years of 1632 and 1704. We're going to talk about the Age of Enlightenment, which occurred during the 17th and 18th century, and that was an age of rational thought and scientific reasoning. And in the year 1693, John Locke wrote an influential parenting manual, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. John Locke really considered children to be a tabula rasa. So children were born as blank slates, not as sinners. He viewed parents' role as providing love, stimulation, and encouragement to fill the slate, and really said that reason is better than punishment. We talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was alive between 1712 and 1778. He had the philosophy that children are born innocent and immoral. Society is a corrupting force, and children reach the age of reason, which is otherwise known as the age of consent, at approximately 12 years of age. And according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he believed that parents should let nature take its course. He was against corporal punishment and advocated for breastfeeding by mothers and not wet nurses, as was, considered a standard at that particular time during history. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about medicine and parenting, which is where a lot of parents tend to get their parenting advice in the year 2016, is from the field of medicine, from pediatricians, nurses, other licensed health or mental health professionals. This is relatively a recent shift when we look at parenting, from a broad-based historical perspective. Until the Age of Enlightenment, healing was often based on superstition. And physicians are seen as experts. They had a strong influence on parenting, but very little parenting advice was dispensed from the medical community based on research until after the 1950s. So again, relatively a newer phenomenon. Luther Emmett Holt was he was really, ahead of his time here, lived between the ages of 1855 to 1924, wrote a work called The Care and Feeding of Children, which informed parents about developmental milestones, proper infant care, and home remedies. This particular book discouraged kissing, playing, or soothing babies, saying that it could make children, hypersexual if they received this kind of stimulation, encouraged rigid schedules for feeding and sleeping, and approved of tying infants' hands to cribs to stop thumb sucking. So this was actually the leading book on parenting for 50 years. And then came the work of Dr. Benjamin Spock, who lived between the ages of 1903, passed away in 1988, and he was raised on Holt's principles. In 1945, the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care came into publication, and Benjamin Spock, hypothesized that parents should really enjoy their children and trust themselves, trust their own inner wisdom and own inner instinct. Dr. Spock also encouraged affection. He encouraged letting children express their individuality. He discouraged feeding schedules. He was a really big proponent of on-demand feeding. Dr. Spock was against physical punishment, and his book was actually the most popular parenting book in history, which was published in 39 languages and sold 50 million copies rather. Talk about the field of psychology and parenting. Going to examine the work of G. Stanley Hall, who lived between the years 1844 until 1924, and he had the first PhD in psychology awarded in the United States. And Dr. Hall believed that young children are savages and require physical discipline. He believed in conformity above individualism, and he despised weakness or deformity and really advocated for forced sterilization and selective breeding. So really controversial by today's standards, right? Continuing our conversation about psychology and parenting, talk about the work of John Watson, who lived between the years of 1878 until 1958. In 1928, John Watson wrote a companion to Holt's parenting book titled The Psychological Care of the Infant and Child. It's really, John Watson was a behaviorist, so he essentially ignored genetics, really focused on behavior and the social environment. He believed that no punishment, stating that most people or most parents don't do it correctly. He also felt strongly that there should be no sentimentality or emotion, no kissing, no hugging or affection, just maybe a little pat on the head for a job that's very well done. Also, talking about Watson, Watson later admitted that he should not have written the book because he was not an expert. And Watson's children were raised on strict schedules and no affection. All four had serious alcohol and psychological problems. Two attempted suicide, one succeeded, sadly. His granddaughter and actress Marriott Hartley revealed how damaging Watson's parenting practices were on his children and grandchildren. So, we want to keep this in mind too, that Watson's work was not based on research, but rather his own experience of parenting. So when we're talking about parenting styles, it's really important to look at the data and the research. Not just what on experts say and what they do, but what does the data and research tell us about this? And also, as I said before, when we're talking about parenting, it is so important to look at your own culture, your own upbringing, your own inner wisdom as a parent. So there's many factors to explore here. So what is the problem with these perspectives? They're all opinion-based. Sometimes they're heavily biased, not based on scientific theory, not based on scientific research. So these particular theories would not fly in the year of 2016. So we need a model that explains the factors or determinants that influence parenting. So we're going to end the discussion today, and then we'll return in our next lecture series, part 4, and begin our discussion in regard to Belsky's parenting theory. So I'll see you in a little bit.